All right, hi everyone. Today we are reading episode 1, chapter 4 of The Assault. He was awakened half an hour or an hour later by the shouting that had echoed through Europe for years. Right away was another flashlight blinding him. He was grabbed by the arm and pulled off the cot and down the hall so fast that he never even saw his cellmate. Germans and policemen were still standing all over the place. An important SS man with a skull on his cap and silver stars and stripes on his collar slammed the cell door shut. He was a handsome man of about 35, with the kind of regular, noble features that Anton had often seen in boys' books illustrations. To lock up such a young boy, he shouted as he climbed up the stairs, and with that terrace yet. He had everybody lost their mind. That blasted communist female didn't belong here either. He would take her to with him to Amsterdam, to his office on Europe Street. It was lucky she hadn't been freed yet, or some of the officials in this place wouldn't have survived either. What kind of pigsty is this? Who had given the orders? What? Someone from the security service. Et tout brute. Probably another one of those two-faced operators getting into position for the next time around, making himself out to be Santa Claus, the great ally of the resistance. That will be of enormous interest to the Gestapo. This boy is lucky he is still alive. How did he get blood? Uh, how did he get blood on his face? Once more, Anton was standing in the waiting room with a gloved finger pointing at him. Blood? He touched his cheeks. A cop pointed to a round shaving glass hanging from one of the steel braces against the wall. He stood on tiptoe and into the magnifying mirror saw the bloody, dried traces of her fingers on his white face and in his hair. That's not mine. So then it was hers, exclaimed the officer. That's the limit. She's been wounded. Get a doctor here at once. He still needed her. As far as the boy goes, take him to the Oxtermandertur, the regional command, for the night so he can be handed over to his family tomorrow. And be quick about it. Bishan, I'm not even going to try. You bunch of cheeseheads. No wonder they're getting themselves mowed down at the drop of a hat. Chief Inspector Plogue had to go for a little bike ride in the dark. The idiot. Wrapped in a horse blanket, Anton was taken outside by a helmeted German. The night was still crystal clear. In front of the door stood a Mercedes, belonging, of course, to the officer, with a convertible linen roof and big compressors next to the hood. The German had a carbine on his back, and the tails of his dark gray coat were tied around his legs, so that he walked with the wide-legged, ungainly tread of a bear. He told Anton to sit behind him on the motorcycle and hold on tight. Anton hitched up the blanket, embraced the huge shoulders, and clung with his torso to the man's gun strapped back. Weaving and skidding, they drove off beneath the stars through the abandoned street to Haarlem, a ride of less than 10 minutes. The snow crunched beneath the tires, but it seemed as if not even sputtering of the motor could disturb the silence. So, now here he was, riding a motorcycle for the first time in his life. In spite of the cold, he had to make an effort not to drop off to sleep again. It was dark and light at the same time. The neck of the German in front of his eyes was a strip of skin with short dark hair between the rubber collar of the coat and the steel of the helmet. Anton was thinking of something that had happened a year ago at the indoor swimming pool. It was supposed to be evacuated at a certain hour for the Wetschmont, but he had dawdled so long in his cubicle that he was too late. Outside, he heard singing and the stamping of boots as the column approached. Hey, lay, hey, lo, hey, la. A little later, the soldiers, laughing and whooping, thundered into the silent bathhouse. He didn't hear any of the cubicle doors opening. They were stripping in the communal area. A minute later, their naked feet splashed in the direction of the swimming pool. When everyone had quieted down, he summoned the courage to slip out. Suddenly, he saw them at the end of the hall, behind the glass door. Inexplicably, they had suddenly changed into human beings, just ordinary men, all naked, white bodies, with brown faces and necks. Arms that were brown up to the elbows. He left in a hurry. He saw the abandoned uniforms hanging in the dressing room, normally used only by poor people. The caps, the belts, the boots, such menace there, all that violence at rest. With the weightlessness suspension of sleepwalkers rising from their beds, the uniforms now detach themselves from their hooks and float toward a burning pile of firewood, tall flames licking the porch of a white country house. But luckily, everything is underwater, in a canal or a swimming pool. The flames hiss as they go out. He woke up with a start. They had to come to a standstill in the Hout, at the entrance to the trench that had been dug around the Oxtermunter. Everywhere he saw barbed wire. A sentry let them pass. In the dark courtyard, there was a coming and going of trucks and cars. Their headlights were shielded with little visors, and the glass was blacked out except for narrow horizontal strips. The racket of motors and horns made a strange contrast to the careful control of the lights. The soldier set the motorcycle on its kickstand and took Anton inside. Here, too, there were unbroken activity. The back and forth traffic of military men, telephones ringing, typewriters clattering. He had to wait on a wooden bench in a small, heated room. Through the open door, he could look into a long hall, and there, suddenly, he saw Mr. Courtway. He came out of one door, crossed the hall, and disappeared. Through the opposite door, accompanied by a hatless soldier carrying papers under one arm. No doubt they already knew what he had done. At the thought that his parents, too, were probably here somewhere, Anton yawned, kneeled over sideways, and fell asleep. When he woke up, he was looking into the eyes of a rather elderly sergeant in a sloppy uniform and a calf-length boots that were too wide, who gave him a friendly nod. Anton was lying in another room under a woolen blanket on a red sofa. Outside, it was daylight. Anton smiled back. Awareness that his house no longer existed came briefly, but vanished at once. The sergeant pulled up a chair. On its seat, he sat down, a tin cup of warm milk and a plate with three large, oblong, dark brown sandwiches spread with something the color of frosted glass. Years later, as he traveled through Germany to his home in Tuscany, Anton learned that this was goose fat. Schmaltz. Never again would anything taste as good. Not even the most expensive dinners in the best restaurants in the world. At Bousquet's in Lyon or Lasserie in Paris, where he would stop on the way back from Italy. Nor could the most expensive Lafite Rothschild or Chambertin ever compare to the warm milk back then. A man who has never been hungry may possess a more refined palate, but he has no idea what it means to eat. Tastes good, said the sergeant after he had fetched another cup of milk and waited amused as this one too was gulped down. Anton had to wash up at a faucet in the toilet. In the mirror, he could see the blood smears on his face had become rust brown. Hesitantly, bit by bit, he removed the only trace left of her. After that, he was ushered into the Oxtermonst room. An arm encircling his shoulders. He hesitated at the threshold, but the sergeant pointed him to the armchair facing the desk. The Oxtermandant, the military governor of the city, was on the telephone and looked at him briefly without actually seeing him, but with a reassuring fatherly nod. A short, fat man with short cropped gray hair. He wore the gray uniform of the Wehrmacht. His holster with a pistol in it lay to his hat on the desk. Near four framed photographs, of which Anton could only see the backs, resting on little triangular holders. On the opposite wall hung a portrait of Hitler. Anton looked out the window at the bare, ice-coated, impassive trees that were totally unaware of what wartime was all about. The Oxfordant hung the receiver on the hook, made a note, searched for something among his papers, then folded his hands on the blotter and asked if Anton had slept well. He spoke Dutch with a heavy accent, but quite clearly. "Yes, sir," said Anton. "It is dreadful what happened yesterday." The Oxtronaut shook his head for a while. "The world is a valley of tears. Everywhere it is the same. My house in Linz was bombed also. Everything. Kaput. Kinder. Dead." Nodding, he kept looking at Anton. "You want to say something, don't you? Go ahead." "Are my father and mother here, maybe?" "They were also taken away yesterday." He knew that he mustn't mention Peter, because that might set them on his trail. The Oxynaut once more began to shuffle papers. "That was another assignment. Sorry, I can do nothing about it. Everything is momentarily messed up. I think they are somewhere near here. We must wait to and see. The war cannot last much longer. Then the ales will have been a bad dream." "Nah," he said with a sudden laugh, and reached out with both arms toward Anton. "What do we do with you? You stay by us? Will you be a soldier?" Anton smiled too and did not know what to say. "What you want to be when you grow up?" He glanced briefly at a small gray card, his identity card. Anton realized. Anton Emilial William Steenswick. "I don't know yet. Pilot, perhaps?" The Oxmonaut smiled, but his smile vanished almost at once. "So," he said, and unscrewed his thick orange fountain pen. "Now, let's get down to business. Do you have family in Haarlem?" "Oh, sir." The Oxtromerdant looked up. "No family at all? Only in Amsterdam. My uncle and aunt." You think you could stay a while? Oh, yes. What's this uncle's name? Van Limpt. First name, Peter. Profession, doctor. He was pleased at the idea of staying with his aunt and uncle for a while. He often thought of their beautiful house on the Apollyon. It had an air of mystery for him, perhaps because of the big city all around it. While the Oxtronaut took down the address, he said in a solemn voice, Phoebus Apollo, the god of light and beauty. Suddenly, he looked at his watch and put down his pen and stood up. Just a moment, he said, and left the room in a hurry. In the hall, he called out something to a soldier, who thundered off. In a while, a small convoy is leaving for Amsterdam, he said, as he returned. You go right along. He called. This was apparently the surgeon's name. He was to accompany Anton to Amsterdam. The Oxmordaunt himself would quickly write a notice to those in charge over there. In the meantime, the boy should be dressed warmly. He went to Anton, shook his hand, and laid the other on his shoulder. Have a safe trip, and be very brave. Yes, sir. Good day, sir. At your service, little one. Anton was pinched on the cheek by the index and middle finger. Then the sergeant led him out of the office, talking all the while in dialect Anton couldn't understand a word of. Schlutz took him to a dank storeroom. There were long rows of soldiers' coats and boots, and on the shelves rows of new helmets. Schlutz pulled out two thick gray sweaters and made Anton wear one on top of the other. He tied a scarf around Anton's head and put the heavy helmet on top. When it sank, wobbling over his ears, Schlutz stuffed paper behind the leather lining and pulled the straps tight, after which it felt fit somewhat better. The sergeant stood back, looked him over, and shook his head, dissatisfied. Pulling a coat from the left end of the row, he held it up to Anton, then took a huge pair of scissors out of a drawer and laid the coat on the floor. Anton watched wide-eyed as Schlitz simply cut the garment down to size, slashing wide strips off the bottom and the sleeves. Anton slipped his arms into them, and Schlitz tried a raveling piece of rope around his middle to keep everything in place. Finally, Schlitz gave him a big pair of lined gloves, after which he burst out laughing, said something unintelligible, and laughed still louder. If only his schoolmates could see it now. But they were probably all still at home, bored stiff, with no idea what was happening to him. Upstairs, Schlitz put on a helmet himself, after he had picked up the letter at the Oxmordaunt's, and stuffed it in his pocket. They left the building. Thin needles of glistening ice fell out of the dark sky. The small convoy stood waiting at the garage across from the fenced-off area. 4 high transport trucks covered with gray canvas, and in the lead a long open car. On the front seat next to the driver sat an officer impatiently waiting for them. On the 2 seats behind were four soldiers muffled in heavy clothes, machine guns in their laps. Anton had to climb into the cabin of the first truck and sit between Schultz and a gruff soldier at the wheel. Such a lot was happening. For Anton, who was still too young to absorb the past, each new event erased the preceding one from awareness and buried it into his subconscious. They left Haarlem, driving through the suburbs, and came to the long, straight, 2-lane highway that ran along the old ship canal to Amsterdam. There was no other traffic. On the left, the overhead wiring of the electric train and the trolley hung to the ground in graceful curves. Here and there, the rails stood upright like horns of a snail. Sometimes even the poles were lying down on all the sides. The hard, frozen ground, they drove slowly. It was impossible to hold a conversation because of the rack inside the cabin. Everything was made of dirty, rattly steel, which somehow told him more about the war than he had ever understood before. Fire and this steel. That was the war. Without meeting anyone, they drove through halfway along the abandoned sugar factory and came to the final stretch of the 20 kilometers to Amsterdam. He could already see the city at the horizon, behind the sandy embankment laid out as his father had explained to him, for a projected ring highway. They were driving along snowed-in peat diggings when the front car suddenly swerved sharply into the embankment. The soldiers waved their arms, shouted, and jumped off the track. At that moment, Anton, too, saw the plane. No larger than a fly, it flew at a right angle across the road. The driver of his truck stepped on the brakes, crying, "Get out," and jumped down himself without turning off the motor. Schultz did the same thing on the other side. All about him, Anton heard shouting. The men in front crouched behind their car, clutching their machine guns ready to shoot. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw something calling him, waving. It was Schultz. But Anton could not take his eyes off the small thing that circled over the road and then came straight at him, growing fast. It was a Spitfire. No, a mosquito. No, a Spitfire. Mesmerized, he stared at the shaky steel that approached as if it loved him. It could not harm him. He was, after all, on their side. They knew that, of course, even yesterday. From below the wings, he saw some flashes crackle. Minor incidents hardly worth of noticing. On the ground, too, fire broke loose. It whistled and popped and rattled on all sides. He felt the blows of the impact, and because he thought the plane would ram into him, he dove below the dashboard, while the motor below above him the motor bellowed above him like a steamroller. A second later, he was pulled out from his hiding place under the steering wheel and dragged to the ditch. To the left and to the right of the road, he saw at least 100 soldiers rising. Farther on, near the last truck, he heard the wounded moaning. When the plane disappeared into the clouds and it became evident that it would not return, Anton, his heart still pounding, crossed the road to join the sergeant. Ice splintering as large as gramophone needles blew into his face. On the other side of the truck, right near the running board, two soldiers carefully turned a body over. It was Schultz. The side of his chest had become a dark pool of blood and tatters. Blood was also coming out of his nose and mouth. He was still alive, but his face was contorted with such pain that Anton felt that he needed to do something at once to relieve it. Suddenly, he turned away, nauseated and in a cold sweat, less from the sight of the blood than from the frustration. He pushed the helmet off his head, loosened the scarf, and groped for the shaking hood of the truck as the vomit spouted out of his wide-open throat. At that instant, the last truck in the column burst into flame. He hardly noticed what happened next. The helmet was being shoved back onto his head, and someone took him into the open car. The officer shouted commands. Schultz and the other wounded and probably dead were laid out in the third truck. All the other soldiers had to pile into the first two. A few minutes later, the convoy was back on the road, leaving the burning truck behind. As Amsterdam approached, the officers kept shouting past him at the driver. Suddenly, he asked Anton who the hell he was anyway, and where he was supposed to be going. Anton understood, but he was breathing so convulsively that he couldn't answer. The officer gestured as if to throw something away, and still he didn't give a shit. Anton kept seeing Schultz's face. He had been lying right next to the truck. He wanted to pull Anton out to safety. It was all Anton's fault, and now Schultz would surely die. They drove into the city through a gap in the embankment. A bit further on, the officer stood up at a street corner and waved the drivers of the first two trucks straight ahead. Briefly, Anton caught a glimpse of his own vomit on the hood of the first one, after which he motioned to the third to follow him. For a while, they drove along a wide canal that was practically deserted. Now and then, they crossed a street where groups of women and children in rags poked around for something between the rusty trolley rails where the stones had been removed. Through narrow, silent streets with dilapidated houses that reached the gate of Western Hospital. Inside the hospital was a city in itself, with its own streets and large buildings. They came to a halt near an emergency shed with an arrow saying Lazaret. Immediately, several nurses ran out. They dressed quite differently from Karen Kortweg, for they wore dark coats down to their ankles and much smaller white caps that enclosed their hair like snoots. The officer and the man on the back seat stepped out of the car, but when Anton wanted to follow, the driver held him back. The two of them drove alone into the city. Anton looked about with a leaden weight in his head. After a few minutes, they passed behind the Rijksmuseum, which he had visited with his father, and came into a wide square with its center fenced off. Here stood two large rectangular bunkers. At the opposite side of the square, right across from the Rijksmuseum, was a building shaped like a Greek temple, with a lyre on the roof. Constabulary was written in big letters under the tympanum. In front of the building was a low structure bearing the sign Werkmachtdem Erica. Several of the large freestanding villas to the right and left clearly had been taken over by the Germans. The car stopped at one of these. A sentinel with a gun over his shoulder looked at Anton and asked the driver if this was the latest recruit. In the hall, too, they laughed at him. The little boy with his helmet and oversized coat, but soon an officer who was about to climb to the stairs put an end to their teasing. He wore shiny high boots and all kinds of braid and badges and ribbons, and around his neck hung the Iron Cross. Perhaps he was actually a general. He came to a stop, four younger officers remaining a few steps behind him, and asked what was going on. Anton could not understand what the driver, who had stepped to the attention, answered, but clearly it was about the plane attack. As he listened, the general took a flat Egyptian cigarette out of the package and tapped it on the lid, where Anton read Istanbul. One of the young officers instantly offered a match. He tipped his head back briefly, blew the smoke straight up into the air, and dismissed the driver with a wave of the hand. Anton had to follow him up the stairs, with the four young officers, who laughed and whispered among themselves. The general's back, straight as a ramrod, leaned forward in at least to a 20-degree angle, Anton guessed. They came to a large room. With an irritated gesture, he ordered Anton to remove those ridiculous garments. Anton looked like a ragamuffin from the ghetto of Bialystok. He said, "I wish the officer smiled." Anton did not know what he was told. And the general opened a door and snarled something into a side room. The younger officers remained in the background. One sat down elegantly in the window seat and lit a cigarette. As Anton took a chair in front of the desk, a pretty slender girl in a black dress entered. Her blonde hair was pinned up on the sides but hung down in the back. She set up a cup of coffee with milk in front of him on the saucer. On the saucer lay a pan of milk chocolate. "Here you are," she said in Dutch. "I bet you like that. Chocolate." Only by hearsay did he know that it still existed. This was very like paradise, but he wasn't given a chance to taste it, for the general wanted to hear what had happened from beginning to end. The girl functioned as an interpreter. The first part of his story about the assault and the fire made Anton cry a little, but it was so long ago by now. Was it? The general listened unmoved, however, now carefully stroking his smoothly brushed hair with the palm of his hand, now caressing his smooth, skinny jaw with the black back of his fingers. But as the story proceeded, he seemed unbelievable to believe his ears. Unable to believe his ears. Oh my god. No, so was. He exclaimed when he heard that Anton had been locked in a cell below a police station. "This is incredible." Anton kept it a secret that someone else has been in there too, that he should have been brought to the Oxmander Tower, after the general said was unheard of. Weren't there any homes for children in Haarlem? The Oxmander Tower, that was really the limit. And the Oxmander had sent him to Amsterdam with a military convoy when he knew perfectly well there were staffers everywhere. Had they all gone crazy in Haarlem? It boggled the mind. It has all been a series of appalling mistakes. He raised his arms and let them fall flat-handed onto his desk. The officer in the window seat burst out laughing at his colorful indignation, and the general then said, "You may laugh all you like. Had the gentleman in Haarlem had the courtesy to give Anton any messages, his paper, for instance, just to name an example?" "Yes," said Anton, but in a flash he saw the sergeant stuff the letter into his inside pocket, the very spot where all the dreadful wound had opened half an hour later. When he began to cry again, the general stood up, annoyed. "Take him away and calm him down and call Haarlem at once. Or not. After all, let them stew in their own juice. Call the uncle and have him pick up the boy." The girl put a hand on his shoulder and let him out. When his uncle appeared an hour later, he was still sobbing in the waiting room. The corners of his mouth were brown with chocolate, and on the lap, a copy of Signal lay open at a dramatic drawing of air combat. His uncle threw it to the ground, knelt in front of him, and silently held him close. Then he stood up and said, "Come on, Anton, let's get out of here." Anton looked up at him and saw his mother's eyes. "Did you hear what happened, Uncle Peter?" "Yes. I have a coat somewhere. Let's get out of here." Holding onto his uncle's hand, without a coat but wearing the two sweaters, he walked out into the winter day. He was sobbing, but hardly knew why, as if his tears had washed away his memories. His other hand felt cold. He stuck it into his pocket where he touched something he could not place. He looked. It was one of the dice.